I'm not used to a microphone, so maybe that's on. If not, I can yell. Well, my name is Amy Kauppila, and I am a senior analytics consultant, if I can get my title right, at InfoWorks, which is a local consulting firm and solutions provider. My major area there is informatics and data science. But really, data science is an area that I've been interested in a long time. I have to confess my background is more or less a math nerd. That's kind of what I am. I had some great teachers in middle and high school who really taught me to appreciate math and how it interacts with our daily lives and how useful it can be. And so that's kind of where I come from. My background is in electrical engineering, which is, again, more math. It's kind of the practical application of math to everything that has to do with electronics. So anything that has an electrical signal, you're going to find an engineer there. That may be anything from a computer to maybe the electrical signals in a person's heart, maybe even like MRIs, designing those kinds of machines. You're going to find some electrical engineers there who are probably excited about the electronics and maybe a little bit about the math too. So my math background is one of the reasons that I appreciate data science and one of the reasons that I like it. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. Data science really allows us to use math to extract these pertinent pieces of information that can be used in a lot of different areas. And the other reason that I like analytics is because it can help us so much. Analytics is used in all kinds of different areas. I mean, if I were to take a poll of the room, I suspect we would span a lot of different types of industry. I mean, you've got business, you have research, you have medicine. But in some of those areas, we can find a lot of benefit. This is a picture of my friend Kristin. This was taken on her wedding day several years ago. And a couple years after this picture, she was diagnosed with very advanced late-stage breast cancer. Obviously, she was still a very young woman. She was actually 30 at the time. And she was diagnosed, and to be honest, it was so late in the game at that point in time. She had stage 4 cancer. The cancer was pretty much everywhere, and there was virtually nothing that could be done. She died shortly after she was diagnosed. And I have often wondered, would things have been different? I mean, she was so young. She had less than a one-year-old little boy. She was so young. Would things have been different had she been able to be diagnosed at an earlier stage in the game? Well, data science has been a tool that researchers have used to, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, to improve the ability of medical physicians and various personnel to diagnose breast cancer at an earlier stage at far earlier rates than they've ever been able to before. So that's one of the reasons, it's one of the practical applications, and one of the things that connects to me personally is how much analytics and data science can help us, not just as organizations, and it can do that. It can help, with your various outcomes, return on investment, all of those, business buzzwords, and it helps there, but it also can be beneficial to people on an individual, on a very personal, real life kind of level. So if conducted with rigor and excellence, we also can participate in that and use our abilities as researchers and an analyst and data scientists to help people and to help our organizations. Now, I have an example. It'll be a little bit later, but for time purposes, I'm going to ask the two people from my company who have been so generous to come and help me. We're going to hand out some M&Ms. Just hang on to them. Don't eat them now. There will be a moment later you can do that, but it's also helpful. Right after lunch, who doesn't like a little sugar? So if y'all could just hang on to them, and they'll serve as an illustration a little bit later. But if we were to look at the goal of data science, if you were to analyze it and break it down, one of our real goals is to collect those pieces of information that are the most pertinent. We've got these massive databases, some of us, and you've got to boil down, all right, why do I care about this data? Maybe a few of us like just the numbers for the sake of the numbers, but that doesn't, just a number doesn't really help us. So we're trying to collect the pertinent pieces of information, extract those moments of value, if you will. And if you were to boil it down, we're trying to get the right information into the hands of the right people at the right time for maximum impact. And that can be very important for our organizations. If you were to talk about why do we use the data, how do we use it? We use it in large part for understanding, to give insight into maybe a business process, or maybe there's some challenges that the organization has, and we're trying to use that to understand those issues. Or maybe we're trying to build a predictive model, something that can be used to anticipate how some subset of reality is going to perform at some point in time with some measure of reliability. So the reason this matters for organizations is because at this point, oh, it's fine, just keep 2. Why not? It's extra candy. Solutions. So increased data can lead to increased understanding and to solutions for the various challenges that we run across. When we're using analytics, we're more or less adding a tool to the tool chest of the various different kinds of tools that we use in everyday work. It's another way of approaching a problem. Y'all may have heard the old saying, even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while, or there's a few different takeoffs on it. But more or less, the idea is you have a squirrel who's aimlessly wandering around, and if you give the squirrel enough time, they're going to find an acorn. Well, it's kind of like we've been doing that on occasion with some of our work. You know, we're just kind of hoping, and we're making some assumptions and best guesses, and sometimes people are very good at that. So I don't want to discount that work. But if we add analytics to the mix, and it's analytics done well, I'll give that little caveat there, we can change this from a squirrel that's aimlessly wandering to a squirrel that's directed finding. And in this case, so you have the squirrel and some analytics, and hopefully less time than the first particular wandering around. And they can get maybe not just 1 acorn, but a whole lot of acorns. So that's the way we would like to approach our analytics work, is that we're using analytics to help us benefit our organizations. So as we're using tools and using the analytics tools, we want to use the right tool set. If we use the wrong tools, it's not going to be nearly as effective. When I was in college, for 3 of my 4 years of undergraduate school, I lived with 3 other girls, and we lived in this little townhouse, and it was not the nicest place, but it was good enough. And we had our little postage stamp of a front yard, and it worked great for a long time. And they were sweet girls. We had very different majors, but they were sweet girls. And one day I came home from class, and I found one of my roommates digging in the front yard. She had wanted to plant flowers, great idea. But she was digging with our cold meat fork. Needless to say, the cold meat fork no longer looked, it was kind of splayed all. And the holes in the front yard were not all that effective either. I could have done that good with a stick. The complicating factor was that cold meat fork belonged to my boyfriend's mother, who had let us borrow it. Fortunately, she's now my mother-in-law, and so she's forgiven me for the moment. But it wasn't, didn't help the fork, and it didn't help the holes in the front yard. So when we're using analytics, we need to understand what we're doing and look at it from the right perspective and pay attention so that we are using. So one of the tools I'm going to talk to you about is data modeling. Modeling is taking information about some subset of reality, maybe some real-life phenomenon, and trying to build understanding for developing insight. Sometimes for reasons. I'll tell you about one in a little bit. It's used because it's very difficult to observe that particular portion of reality directly. It's just very, very small. So they're a representation of some subset of reality, and we can take data and build them. One that you may use that I used a lot in the last couple of days trying to find my way down here is maybe a mapping tool. Here's a picture of Google factors that go into this. This is obviously this is not just a little model, this is an enormous model, but it's based on information and data, and someone, probably a lot of someone's, has gone and built these tools. And these can be used for understanding. I use Google Maps for a lot of different reasons. One is to understand where the closest restaurants are, or how do I get from point A to point B, and also, more importantly sometimes, how long is it going to take me to get from point A to point B. So sometimes using some of these tools can be very beneficial in that particular fashion. This is a picture that I'll explain. In my doctoral and subsequent research, I used to build models of little bitty circuits. In this case, these are sub 100 nanometer memory cells. So if you'll notice, this kind of gray, grainy looking picture is a picture of some of these cells on a very close scale. These are actually SRAM cells, if I have any engineers or computer people who know what these are. And then on the left there, that's a larger picture. That's the picture of a whole circuit of these particular types of devices. I built these particular models so that we could look at how parameter variations, how manufacturing changes, because anytime you manufacture something, there are some variations in how it's done. You may be shooting for this needs to be 65 nanometers wide, and it's probably close. But even if you have a 10% variation and it's that tiny little scale, that impacts how that circuit performs. And so it's important to be able to understand how the manufacturing variations impact that on a small scale level, not just for the small scale level, but so that you know how the entire chip performs. And so I was looking at the manufacturing variations and how that impacted a circuit's ability to perform during certain types of perturbation. It was a little nerdy, but you get the idea. It was useful work because in order for us to be able to understand how your computers work, how your cell phones work, anything that has to do with these chips, we have to understand fully how they work on a very small scale level. And this is so small that it cannot be directly measured. I mean, you can't stick a probe down there. This is way too small for the human eye really to even see. So it has to be modeled to some extent. And when we were modeling these, we used all of the different variations in manufacturing changes. So there were 50, 60 varying factors that would go into this. And out of that, you have to pull out which ones of these 50 or 60 factors make a difference. Which ones are my key parameters? Which ones are the ones that I care about? Or do I care about any of them? Or are they all important? And you have to answer those kinds of questions. We all have to answer those kinds of questions when we're developing a model. Which ones of our input variables matter? And which ones of them impact us in the bottom line? Which ones of us help, if you will, help us understand what's going to bring success to our particular model? When we are looking at building a data model, it's important to understand that these models are probabilistic in nature. They are, at best, estimates of reality. Now, they can be very, very good estimates of reality, and that's what we're all shooting for. But we have to understand that they are estimates. I have here on the screen a sine wave. That's that, I don't know what your backgrounds are, but that's the little kind of squirrely looking signal there. And it is an analog signal. All of the signals that you're going to run across in real life are analog in nature. That means they're continuous. There's no disjointed parts. They're all continuous. Like if you were to think about the speed of your car, if you were to graph the speed of your car over time, it's a continuous signal. It doesn't all of a sudden jump from 20 miles an hour to 70. Now, it might have a steep slope, particularly depending on what kind of car you drive, but it's still a continuous signal. Or if you were to look at the electrical signals in the human heart, it's a continuous signal. It's something that has no disjointed properties. But when we move those analog signals, anything that exists in the real world, if we move it from the real world that we all interact with, and we move it to the computer world, then it moves from analog to digital. And I represented that on this graph with these dots. The way we do that is we take samples from the analog signals and try and represent that, these little dots as samples, and we use that to input those numbers into a computer. So even with a lot of dots, if we take a lot of samples, at best we're getting most of the data, but we're not quite getting all of it. If you were to think about it, it's kind of like the difference between looking at a picture at a place and being there. This is a picture we took a few years ago on a family vacation, and it was gorgeous that day, I have to admit. Now, of course, mountains are my thing. Some people are beach people. I'm a mountain person. you have snow on a mountain and it's a rugged mountain and you have, fir trees in the background, I'm happy. But it was beautiful, and I like looking at the picture, but being there was better. There's a difference between being somewhere, you feel the wind in your face or the sun. There's just more to it. Being somewhere is great, but a picture, Or you think about it, the difference between listening to live music. After all, we are a music city. The difference between listening to live music and recorded music. Recorded music is great. We all listen to recorded music all the time. But there's something special about listening to live music, about the interaction of the musicians and the audience, of being able to feel the vibrations of the music. It's better. But the recording is the best, at this point, is kind of the best estimate we can get. So anytime we are looking at data, we are only looking at a fraction of reality. So we're using our fraction of reality to try and model it to the best of our ability. The probability of the output of our model accurately reflecting the little subset of reality that we're trying to model depends on the quality of the model and the quality of the data that we're using. Like any good area, it seems like anytime you're doing anything worthwhile, there's going to be a lot of challenges. Data modeling is no different. There are a lot of challenges in data modeling. I've heard it estimated that between 65 and 80% of big data projects fail. That's a lot. Particularly if we're going to sink a lot of investment into that kind of a project, that's not what a company is shooting for. And that also doesn't help us move analytics in the right direction where it's used. And I think we can see the promise of all it can do. And if we want to achieve that promise, we're going to have to be able to make our projects more successful. So the question is, how do we get around some of these data modeling challenges? Well, depends on what kind there are. You think about it, there could be any number of different types of challenges. Security challenges around how do you take care of the data? Because it's important to protect the data regardless of what you're doing. Maybe there are difficulties with integrating into the existing business structures. That is a sizable challenge and not one to be underestimated. Lack of expertise. Sometimes a challenge understanding, or maybe just personnel limitations. Maybe you don't have enough people to accomplish a project, or they're not the right kind of people that you need, or they don't have the right skill set. But there are also data questions. And these also can be reasons for failure. You have all these lists of questions, and these are just a smattering of some. There are dozens more. You have things like, what data do I have? Does the data that I have could it answer the questions that I have for my particular business, for the process that I'm looking at? Is the data located all in one location? Chances are pretty good it's not. And you have to get it all in one location. Well, how are you going to do that well? Is all the data in the right format to be used? Or do we need to maybe do some natural language processing on, let's pretend like there's a customer service phone call that you need to extract some information out of, and you can do some natural language processing on that to extract the pertinent information so that then it can be used to develop the model that you need to develop. How accurate is the data? Now this one's a doozy. Anytime you measure anything, there's always inaccuracies. There's noise, there's interference, there's all kinds of issues. This summer, let me step back. I have 3 children, and 2 of them are swimmers, and they swim all year. It's not like a normal sport where you have a season and then you get to quit. That would be nice. But you only get 3 weeks off in August, and so then I have 2 pinballs at home. So my husband and I have timed more than I'd like to count at swim meets. So one of the things that I've noticed at a swim meet, when you're timing, they have a couple of different ways of timing. Sometimes there'll be 3 individual timers, like people with stopwatches standing there going, all right, and trying to calculate and measure how long it is from the swimmer to go from whenever they stop to whenever the race is over. Or sometimes they'll use electronics, and then you really need to have 3 people timing because electronics and water always go together very well. But the reason they have 3 people standing up there timing is multiple-fold. Sometimes it's because somebody forgets to start their stopwatch, and that happens. But it's also because even when we're doing the best job we possibly can at mashing the buttons at the right time, we're only getting an estimate of exactly how long it took the swimmer to finish the race. And so a lot of times what they'll do is they'll compare the 3 times and say, all right, well, this one's, it's off, so we're gonna assume that the timing is close. So we're just doing that to make a better estimate, to get a more accurate reading of how long the swimmer took to accomplish the race. The same principle applies to our data. Whenever we're looking at data, we're going to do the best we can to get the right data, and I hope that whoever took the measurement is doing the best they can. But we have to understand that it's close to accurate, but it's not quite there. Another issue, how do I find a weak signal in a large data set? And it's kind of related to the next two of which factors and inputs are significant, related, or dependent, and which data is relevant. Sometimes if we have a lot of different factors, like when I was looking at the SRAM cells and you've got umpteen bajillion factors trying to come into play, it is hard to know which factor is important, which one of these several parameters is the one that I care about, or the set that I care about, because sometimes it's more than one. And being able to identify that is very important and can also be extremely challenging. It's kind of, I like to cook. I don't like to clean all that much, but I like to cook. And so sometimes, over the years, I've gotten to be a bit of a food snob. And so sometimes we'll splurge on some high quality ingredients. But in like a cake, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to buy the genuine Madagascar high-end vanilla, or can you just use the vanilla extract? Which is it worth? You know, is it worth the hassle or not? So when we're building a model, the same kind of thing applies. Is it worth it to go to the extent of buying the more expensive ingredient, of inputting, you know, the more challenging factor to bring in, because that's going to add extra complication, extra work, extra time. It's going to make the whole model a little bit more challenging. Is it worth it to bring in that extra factor or not? And knowing the difference can help make that model, you know, you're trading off simplicity for complexity, maybe speed for a slightly slower model. It's just some of those issues that you have to bring into play and know which is correct. But you know, in spite of all these challenges, the problems still exist. The business problems still need to be solved. Research still needs to be conducted. People still need to develop cures and ability to diagnose cancer earlier. So it's important to continue on. So knowing that these challenges exist, I'm going to pose 3 recommendations on how you can make your modeling projects more successful. So here's, excuse me. You're supposed to have a successful data modeling. Okay. Next, the major point is C. It is important, I would argue vital, and maybe the most important part of your project at all, is to truly see the project. If we do not spend the time required to follow, but all the way top to bottom, the whole way through, we are not going to have, our projects will not be as successful. It is vital that we fully understand the projects. Sometimes this takes extra time and effort. Sometimes this part is a little bit invasive. You have to ask the hard questions. You have to maybe politely and respectfully get in somebody's face and understand what they're doing, because sometimes there's a little bit of pushback with anytime you bring in a new technology. But this is important, and understanding it is vital. It's not enough to understand the techno-babble. Anytime there's a new area, and I feel like analytics is still gaining traction, there's a lot of new words and terms. Let me explain this picture a little bit. These are 3 graduate students who are now long graduated. They were MIT graduate students, and they created this program called SciGen. And SciGen kind of poked fun at technobabble. What this program does is you input a bunch of different words, and generally the idea is to make them, more computer science-y kind of words, and it spits out a paper. Now, this paper means nothing. Absolutely nothing. It has, and I've read a few of the abstracts of some of the papers, and if you're not paying attention, they sound pretty good. Because you assume that the challenge is not with you or with the paper. You assume that you just don't understand the paper. And so they built this, and it's been used. As a matter of fact, approximately 85, and of course I wouldn't, if I were somebody who'd submitted it, I'm not gonna tell. So 85 papers have been submitted and accepted to reputable conferences. And the papers meant absolutely nothing, which I think kind of says something, but I digress. But the point is, we don't want to have those kind of analytics projects. We're not shooting for this kind of project. We're not shooting for something that sounds really cool but doesn't really accomplish anything. We're looking for something that's really going to move the ball forward, that's going to be beneficial to our organizations. So as funny and as comical as this is, that's not what we're shooting for. We really need to make sure we understand the material very, very well. It's important to spend the time to think critically. For our analytics efforts to succeed, for our money to be well spent, we need to put in the required time to understand the possibilities and maybe the limitations of an analytics project. Understanding is going to build success. Anytime you're working on this kind of a project, think through the project. How is the data that I have, for instance, going to accomplish the business objective that I have? How are we going to take this data and massage it into the right thing so that we're able to extract those moments of value out of it? It's important to define the purpose correctly. Here's an example. This is an old example. This is from World War II. In World War II, obviously, the United States was sending airplanes, and they were over Europe, and they were fighting, and some of those airplanes, unfortunately, got shot down. The story goes that in approximately 1943, the United States government came to a group of researchers at Columbia University called the Statistical Research Group, the SRG, and they said, look, we have this problem. Too many of our airplanes are being shot down, and that means too many of the pilots and the flight crews and the airplanes, which were also helpful, that they were getting shot down behind enemy lines, and that was becoming a problem. And they were saying, all right, we need to know a few things, but the main thing we need to know is how do we keep these planes from being shot down? How do we reduce the probability that a plane that we send over enemy airspace is going to return? And so the faculty members and researchers put their heads together, and they ran a bunch of numbers and analyzed a bunch of things. And one of the things that we're told that they put together was something like this. And they took a map of all the planes that had returned home, and they said, look, here's all the different places where they have been shot. And so they created a little map of it. And they said, these must be the places where airplanes are more likely to get hit. So we ought to reinforce those places. Unfortunately, you can't reinforce the whole plane because then the plane doesn't fly. If you put too much weight on the plane, it doesn't fly. So they were trying to pick the optimal place to put the extra armoring to protect the plane. And this was their plan. They were going, this is a great idea, and it makes sense. If the plane's going to get hit there, we ought to put, extra reinforcement there to protect the plane, keep it from getting shot down. But one of the researchers, a gentleman named Abraham Wald, you'll see a picture of him there in the corner. He said, we're thinking about this problem the wrong way. We're thinking about how the planes that get home look. If you were to consider it, enemy air fire ought to hit a plane roughly equally. And what we're doing if we do go with the proposed method is we're protecting the wrong part of the airplane. If a plane gets shot in those particular locations, it's able to make it home. It's able to make it back to base. If we consider where the planes get shot that don't come back, they're the ones who are getting shot in these areas of the gaps, in these highlighted areas. And he said that's where we need to add the reinforcement. And indeed, he was correct. So when we're looking at an analytics project, a modeling project, we want to make sure that we're thinking about it correctly. Because while the logic of most of the members of the statistical research group makes sense, what they were recommending was the absolute wrong thing to do and would have, in fact, hurt the likelihood of the airplane coming back. If we think about it very carefully, we're much more able to make wise assessments and to make choices that will help make more data modeling success. And that's what we're shooting for. One of the last things we need to consider, and this is something that's maybe a little bit less pleasant to think about. It's not bad, it's just something that's maybe sometimes an afterthought, is to consider how we're going to do a few things. One is model verification. How are we going to ensure that our model that we build is correct? There's a lot of different approaches, but we need to make sure we build that into our assessment. Next one is, what measures of uncertainty do we have? How are we going to do uncertainty classification? And then the last is error quantification. We may already know from the beginning of the project, here are the places where we're going to see errors. We know that this number is approximately 98% correct, or maybe it's 99% correct, or maybe we have one that's kind of like a coin flip. We need to include those so that we can give an estimate at the beginning of how accurate our model could be. Then one other area is to recognize the limitations. When we're dealing with a scientific model, we are in fact making an estimate of reality, and we're making that estimate of reality based on the data that we have. Let me give an illustration. If you were to go to the grocery store and someone were to look at your grocery cart at the end of your grocery shopping, what would they be able to determine about you from just looking at that grocery cart? Probably some. If you looked at my grocery cart when I bought all these M&Ms, you would have thought I had a candy problem. It's actually a lot of M&Ms. But we can look at that with some measure of accuracy, and Target obviously has done that at various different points in history quite well. But depending on how long of a track record we have of somebody's grocery always shop for another person, there are limitations to that. We may get something wrong in our assumptions that we make about their grocery shopping history. The challenge of that is when we move it from data into an algorithm. When we put something in algorithms, people tend to believe what a computer says. Y'all all know this. You've seen what your friends and acquaintances post on various social media sites. They believe stuff that you're going, surely you don't believe that. But there's something about putting in an algorithm that people tend to believe. And if we put in a bias, an accidental bias, like maybe we're looking at somebody's grocery cart and we say, you know, this looks like a guy and it's really a girl, or vice versa. Or maybe somebody is buying some things for an elderly relative, and we make the wrong assumption about that person. If it's built into an algorithm and it's done on a regular basis, it's very hard to diagnose that problem. It becomes almost a black box issue. So that's more of the reason we have to think through our concerns very early in the process so that we can make accurate judgments and make wise decisions about our projects. So the next step after to see and to fully understand the problem is to select. And what I'm meaning by this is to select the appropriate data. So I have an example. This is where the M&Ms come into play. You can get them out and look at them. If whoever can find the first Navy M&M, raise your hand. We have a prize in the back for you. All right. Are they Navy? Find a Navy one. Okay, well, Bill.
I found one.
Well, if y'all could go to the back, and the first couple, there's some nice prizes and whatnot. All right, and I have lots of prizes, and so they'll be available afterwards. Oh, wow. All right, if everybody else could wait until the end of the program, there will be. Yeah, maybe should have thought that one through a little more, huh? It's pretty cool, huh?
I like free stuff.
All right, well, while we're continuing on, while they're getting their prizes, let me talk through the various different M&Ms. All right, not all of the packages of M&Ms were the same. What are some of the things, this is the audience response portion, what are some of the things you observed about, maybe look at your neighbors, or what are some of the different things? I saw somebody holding up one that was a little bit different.
Well, some have less M&Ms.
Okay, so you have one that has like a lot of M&Ms and one that has like, a handful.
Because I have better probabilities.
Yeah, so there's one that's got a normal amount, but there's something else weird with that one. What else is about that one? Woo. Describe yours. They're all purple. Okay, so all purple. You have one that's all purple. Same thing. Okay. Huh? That's a whole different, yeah. That'll be an issue. Well, I'm using these to model different things about data. All right, let me describe them for you. All right, some of these, it's important when we're looking at data to make sure that we're picking a data size that's appropriate. If we have, a couple of these bags had like a handful of M&Ms. And if you found a Navy M&M in that bag, that made it really easy to spot. It's kind of like if you have a small data set and you're able to find that the point of significance, that piece of information that's going to make the difference for your company, and you're able to spot it in a small data set, that's great. The challenge was that, the problem with that is that if we have a sample size that's too small, it's not statistically significant. And at that point, then regardless of whether or not we think we found a piece, something of value, it may not be there. So I hate to say it, but some of the small little ones didn't have a Navy M&M in there at all to kind of symbolize that. Now, if you got one of those, you can still, later on at the end, you can still get something. Another one was to filter out the noise. And, the larger data, the larger bags of M&Ms, those were to represent a larger data set. They're nice to have, but sometimes it's harder to find the important piece because your data set is so large, it can become unwieldy and become cumbersome, and it's hard to figure that out. Another one is to filter out the noise. There's a couple of different kinds of noise. One is just, noise that's, measurement error kind of noise. But there's something else about just having too many things at once. Like a few minutes ago when all of y'all were talking, it's harder to hear one person talk over other people. So that noise makes it more difficult to hear the message that you're looking for. You can have the same thing in data or in purple M&Ms versus finding a navy one. It's hard to see the navy one for the purple, particularly in the lighting. So if we have stuff in our data set that makes it difficult to see the pieces that are important, that can be a challenge and something that we have to pay attention to and be aware of when we're trying to select the right data. Another one is data governance. Did anybody notice that they had Skittles? Yeah, there's Skittles in some of them. If we don't pay attention to our data governance, we don't have M&Ms in our data set, we have Skittles, and that doesn't help us at all. So it's important to pay attention to the data we have and to be able to to select the right data set to make the model so that we use our time and effort in the best way possible and use the money and the resources that are allocated to that particular project in a manner that builds success. I did want to mention one thing. Did anybody eat the M&Ms early? I don't have anybody fessing up to it much. But that's kind of like, there's a glitch in the data. Your data was gone. The next one is to start. So it's important to see the issue. It's important to select the right data. But it's also important to start your project. In any time we're looking at, really in all of life, we all have to start where we are. Sometimes we'd like to start somewhere else, or we'd like to be 5 years down the road, or we wish we had started something different 5 years ago. But we have to start where we are, and that's okay. In this modeling, in this world, as we could get to, and to envision, this wonderful thing, our goals, and we're going to be able to use analytics in all these great ways, and it's going to revolutionize business. And I think given enough time, it will. And it's important to shoot for the moon in a sense. I had it told to me not long ago that if you shoot for the moon, you're not likely to end up with a fistful of mud. So shoot for the moon. Absolutely shoot for the moon. But recognize that real life may come in, and it may say you have to start with a smaller project. But don't be discouraged with starting with a smaller project. A smaller project is, in fact, maybe the perfect place to start. Smaller projects enable you to do a lot of different things. They may enable you to practice, to get better at it. It may help you get your organization more comfortable with the idea of using analytics. It may provide a quick win to say, look, it worked for this area. see how much benefit we can get if we use it in some of these other areas. So design, and maybe it's not all that accurate, but it's a place to start. And as you continue along, you get, the next iteration is a little bit better. And it's more accurate, and maybe not quite as simple, but as you continue in the design cycle, you get something that's increasingly accurate, and you're trading off that accuracy for simplicity, but you're developing the product through the design cycle. And that's a really excellent way to do things. As a matter of fact, incremental design and testing is one of currently the most recommended ways to write software. So this is a well-documented, long-existing approach. We can use the same kind of thing when we're tackling modeling projects. We can start with something that's a little bit simpler and then add onto it and make it more accurate. As long as we keep the long-term goal in mind, starting small is the best place to win big, if you will. It's important to have realistic accuracy, to recognize that whenever we're dealing with a project, whenever we're dealing with some of these probabilities, our data is close to correct, and our approach is maybe close to correct, but we're getting into maybe some of the challenges of getting something that's not quite right. Maybe it's going to be 80% accurate, but 80%'s pretty good. As a matter of fact, if you were to think about it, let's think about the weather forecast. How many of you look at the weather forecast? Okay. Is it always right? Why do you still look at it? It's mostly right. As a matter of fact, companies, particularly construction companies, look at a weather forecast on a regular basis. They use the weather forecast to decide whether or not they're going to rent some of this expensive equipment. A construction company may not own the equipment, but they're going to use the weather forecast to predict whether or not they ought to rent it. Because if it's supposed to be rainy, you don't want to have $10,000 worth of equipment that you've rented sitting in the mud. But if it's going to be sunny, you'd like to have rented the equipment so that you use the time. Now, every so often, they're going to get it wrong. Sometimes they're going to have equipment that they rented that's sitting in the mud, and sometimes they're going to have a sunny day that they didn't anticipate. But more often than not, on the whole, they're going to be much more likely to be accurate. They're going to have an increased probability of renting the equipment in a better way by using the weather forecast. Or if you were to think about vaccines. Vaccines are not 100% effective. In 2006, if I have my dates correct, there was the first shingles vaccine that was used in the United States was introduced here. And it reduced a person's likelihood of getting shingles by about 51%, from what I understand. That's pretty good. I've heard horrible things about shingles, and I would like to reduce my likelihood of getting shingles by at least 50%. So that was the recommended course of action. So people would get the shingles vaccine, and their 51% helps people a lot. If you can reduce somebody's likelihood of getting shingles by 50%, that's a worthy goal. In 2017, a newer version of the shingles vaccine came out. So next step, they got a little better. The industry did better, and this one is a little bit over 90% effective at preventing somebody from getting shingles. That's excellent. And so I don't think anybody was discouraged with the 50%. It was a great place to start, and it was a way to get to 90%. So shoot for the moon. There's no reason not to. So start where you are, wherever that is. Maybe you have a huge project. Maybe it's a smaller project. Maybe you're just introducing your company to the idea or your organization, or maybe you're just starting to use it in your research. But start where you are, and then improve. There's a story that is about an old version of Monopoly that's told. Some of you may know this story. It's reasonably new to me. But in World War II, British intelligence partnered with a company called Waddington Limited, who was the United Kingdom publisher of Monopoly. And they were partnering with them to build a special version of Monopoly. This version of Monopoly was one that could be used by captured soldiers who were in German prisoner of war camps, and they were used to help them escape. They had special things in them. Sometimes in the board, they would have knife blades. I've heard that some of them had hacksaws, obviously just the blade. They would have compasses built in there. They would have the money, they'd have fake money on top, and then they'd have real money underneath. And these were done, and they were sent to the various prisoner of war camps via charities. They would also have in there included, depending on which POW camp it was sent to, they would have maps printed, and they were mapped too many times, it gets a tear. It's harder to do with silk, and it doesn't make any noise. If you wad it up, it doesn't make any noise. So these were used, and the challenge was how to make them recognizable by the soldiers who had been captured and not by the Germans. The Germans were pleased for people to, for the prisoners to use games because they felt like it kept them out of trouble, kept them from wanting to escape, and keep them occupied, trying to reduce challenge. And so these weighed the same amount as a regular Monopoly game. So if you'd had two of them sitting there, it would have been next to impossible to have told the difference. As a matter of fact, most soldiers didn't even know that they were special versions of Monopoly. It was kind of a closely guarded secret because they didn't want the Germans to find out and then get rid of all the Monopoly games. So they recognized that while they might not be able to help everybody, they would help some. And there are estimates that as many as 10,000 people escaped using that. Now that's just an estimate, but if it were 5, that'd be worth it. There were only a few ways to be able to tell the difference. And so one of them was that there was supposedly a red dot on the free parking space. And there were a couple other minor differences, but if you were a soldier who was captured and you had this specialized Monopoly game and you didn't recognize, you didn't know what it was, it wouldn't have helped you any at all. What you had and had this specialized Monopoly game, all of a sudden that Monopoly game makes an enormous your research, and maybe even farther than that. So as you're shooting for these kinds of projects and as you're trying to accomplish wonderful things, and I think many of you will, I think you'll all go and do great things. Remember to fully understand the issue, to select the data that's optimized for your model, and then to begin somewhere, and then to enhance the model, and then to succeed. Well, thanks. Any questions? Any questions? Okay, if there are not any, as y'all are heading out and you would like some of our swag, the 2 ladies are back there to help out. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask me. Y'all have a great day.